The sleek conference hall of Sterling Aerospace buzzed with tension. 200 of Detroit's top engineers, executives, and media representatives filled the room, their eyes locked on the unfolding drama. At the center of it all stood Eleanor Mitchell, 35 years old, clad in a plain white shirt and worn-out jeans, a jarring contrast to the sea of suits and lab coats. Behind her loomed the R-7000 aircraft engine, a $2 million masterpiece of innovation that had left Sterling's elite MIT-trained team baffled for 3 straight days. Richard Sterling, the CEO himself, stepped forward, microphone in hand, his tone thick with scorn. "This woman thinks she can join our engineering elite? No degree, no credentials, just fantasy." With that, he hurled a wrench at Eleanor's feet. The metallic clang echoed through the silent room. "You have 30 minutes. Fail, and you're out. For good." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Eleanor crouched, picked up the wrench, her fingers shaking. A shadow of pain flickered in her brown eyes. They didn't know her. Not really. What would you do in her place? Fight or walk away? Sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when to reveal your truth. Tell us below. Can dignity defeat arrogance? Eleanor Mitchell lived in a small weathered apartment on Detroit's east side, where the hum of factory machines sang through the paper-thin walls at night. Each morning, at exactly 5 o'clock, she brewed her black coffee in a chipped ceramic mug and sat beside the window overlooking the smoky skyline of the industrial zone, a place once deeply familiar. But she would catch herself and push those memories away. The neighbors saw her as the quiet woman from the library, the one who shelved books and tutored kids with spelling and science. She wore plain white shirts bought in bulk, the same scuffed sneakers every day, and kept her brown hair tied in a low, no-nonsense ponytail. No rings, no makeup, nothing extra. Mrs. Henderson, her elderly neighbor, often told others that Eleanor seemed like such a sweet woman, but something about her felt heavy, like she carried some kind of silent sorrow. And Mrs. Henderson was right, because not long ago, Eleanor had applied to Sterling Aerospace, not for an executive role, not even as an engineer. She applied as a technician, a position usually taken by college grads starting out. When asked about her background in the first interview, she'd been deliberately evasive. Education. Hands-on. Previous jobs. Local auto shops, fixing engines. Mark Davidson, the hiring manager, gave her a doubtful look. Why would someone her age want an entry-level job? "You've got no official training? No paperwork?" he asked. Eleanor didn't flinch. Sometimes skill speaks louder than certificates. But the practical exam told its own story. She diagnosed engine faults using sound alone, and her hands moved over the machinery with practiced grace, like someone touching an old friend. She finished the technical challenge in less than half the time given, solving problems that had stumped the company's most seasoned staff. Soon, rumors spread like wildfire through the Sterling building about the strange woman with no resume but supernatural talent. The buzz reached Richard Sterling himself, and his reaction was immediate and angry. "Impossible," he spat during the Monday board meeting. "No untrained woman outperforms my engineers." His ego wouldn't allow it. He needed to disprove it, to crush it. And so the so-called special interview was arranged, not to test Eleanor's skill, but to ridicule her, to remind everyone that aerospace engineering was reserved for pedigreed minds and proper appearances. Eleanor knew exactly what it was, a performance to break her spirit. And still, she came. Because what they didn't know could change everything. Secrets she had kept hidden for 5 years were about to rise. 5 years earlier, in Houston, Texas, the Johnson Space Center auditorium gleamed with camera lights and congratulatory cheers. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, just 30 years old, stood confidently at the podium in a sleek navy suit that radiated quiet power. She had just been named the youngest chief engineer in NASA's Orion program history. Her work on a next-generation propulsion system had achieved staggering results. cutting fuel use by 40% and boosting performance by 60%. Dr. Mitchell hasn't just brought us closer to Mars, the NASA director said with pride. She's changed what's possible in this field. The room roared with applause. Eleanor scanned the crowd, her eyes seeking one face above all others. Daniel Walsh, her fiancé and co-developer of the technology. He sat in the front row, beaming with pride. They had spent years in the lab together, dreaming, building, sacrificing. Their future seemed certain. The next morning, they were supposed to file the joint. The patent was ready, and the wedding was set for the following week. A small ceremony with their closest NASA colleagues as guests. But that night, everything collapsed like a weakened alloy under too much stress. Eleanor had returned to the lab to retrieve her personal notebook and found Daniel hunched over her terminal, downloading their classified research onto external drives. "Daniel, what are you doing?" she had asked, her voice caught between confusion and dread. He turned to her, calm and unrepentant, his expression void of shame. "What I should have done months ago. Lockheed offered $50 million, for me alone." The words struck like a hammer blow. "This was our work, NASA's work. You can't just—" He cut her off with a bitter, mocking laugh. "Our work? Don't kid yourself, Eleanor. No one's going to believe a 30-year-old woman designed this. You were a cover, sweetheart." The betrayal crushed her. 5 years of shared dreams, whispered promises, and sleepless nights had been nothing but calculated deceit. Daniel had documented everything to frame himself as the genius and her as a background helper. She had tried to stop him, tried to block the exit, but he triggered a security alert before she could do anything. "She's stealing classified data," he had yelled with perfect panic in his voice. Within seconds, chaos erupted in the lab. Sirens blared. Guards stormed in. In the confusion, Daniel sabotaged key systems, igniting a chain reaction that led to an explosion. The blast obliterated critical evidence and left Eleanor severely injured, nerve damage to her dominant right hand, the same hand that had once shaped spacecraft designs and delicate circuitry. An official inquiry dragged on for months, but Daniel had covered his tracks well. He had planted forged emails, tampered with surveillance footage, even bribed former colleagues. They swore under oath that he had done the lion's share of the work. The system branded her a liability, quietly pushed her out to avoid scandal. But the cruelest wound wasn't the career loss or the physical pain. It was hearing, in sworn deposition, that Daniel had been working for Lockheed all along. "You were perfect," he had said, like he was describing a lab rat. "Smart enough to build it, gullible enough to think it was love." Her name was erased from the records. His appeared on patents. The propulsion system, her propulsion system, became Lockheed's crown jewel. Eleanor left Houston that night without ceremony. She packed away her MIT diploma, her NASA medals, and the engagement ring still in its velvet box. Standing alone in her apartment, she made a decision. She wouldn't waste years fighting a rigged legal battle. She wouldn't beg for redemption in a world that believed in names more than truth. She would vanish, strip away her past, her ambition, her brilliance. She would become no one, a ghost among the living, content to survive in obscurity. But 5 years later, here she was, staring at a machine that bore her stolen legacy, rebuilt by Sterling Aerospace under a new name, but unmistakably hers. And now, history was circling back like a storm. The Sterling Auditorium buzzed with cynical excitement. They didn't want a solution. They wanted a spectacle, a public takedown, a reminder of who was allowed to belong. Richard Sterling swaggered across the stage like a ringmaster before the show, soaking up every drop of attention. His voice boomed through the auditorium. "Today, ladies and gentlemen, you'll see why we at Sterling only hire the best, the credentialed, the vetted." He cast a mocking smile at Eleanor. "Miss Mitchell here believes she belongs among us. No formal training, no recognized experience, just misguided ambition. The crowd chuckled, sensing blood in the water. James Morrison, the engineering head, stepped up beside Sterling, his hand casually resting on his hip, MIT ring flashing like a badge. "Richard, we're wasting time. She's clearly just another amateur who thinks fixing carburetors makes her an engineer." Sarah Chen, the lead systems architect, chimed in with open derision. "I reviewed her file. Library clerk, backyard mechanic. This isn't a sandbox, it's aerospace." Her words reeked of the same smug gatekeeping Eleanor had once endured, back when she had the pedigree to challenge it. But now, stripped of identity, she was just another outsider daring to challenge the temple. A young engineer, fresh-faced, barely old enough to rent a car, pointed at Eleanor's slightly trembling hand. "Look, she's shaking already," he said, loud enough for the front row to hear. "Probably never even touched a real jet engine." The laughter rose, cruel and unchecked. Reporters angled their cameras for the perfect shot of humiliation. Tech bloggers whispered titles into their phones. "Fraud at Sterling," "Woman without degree," "Crashes and burns." Then Richard stepped forward again, gesturing grandly to the R7000. "This engine," he announced, "contains a critical flaw." As her fingers made contact with the engine's cool, metallic skin, a tidal wave of memory crashed over Eleanor. Late nights in the NASA propulsion lab, the sound of test fires echoing through hangars, the sacred silence before breakthrough. She remembered the thrill of creation, the joy that came from breathing life into machines, the long hours she and Daniel had spent bent over blueprints. She used to think the way his hands closed over hers was romantic, intimate. Now she saw it for what it was: ownership, a quiet assertion of dominance, theft masquerading as affection. "Clock's ticking," Sarah chimed, her voice laced with smugness. "Need help finding the engine cover, or should we call a real engineer?" Laughter erupted around her, but Eleanor didn't react. She was already inside the machine in her mind. What she saw there turned her veins to ice. It wasn't just similar to her Orion prototype, it was her Orion prototype. But twisted, broken. The harmonic resonances were all wrong. The compression algorithms were mismatched. This wasn't an engine. It was a time bomb. Whoever had sold this to Sterling, Daniel himself or a middleman, had turned her legacy into a disaster waiting to happen. 20 minutes, Richard called out with theatrical relish. "Don't suppose you need instructions on which end is up?" More laughter, more cameras clicking. Eleanor barely noticed. Her mind was racing now, moving faster than it had in years. She could speak up, reveal the truth, tell them who she was and what this engine really represented. But they wouldn't believe her. Not without proof. Not without a demonstration no untrained garage mechanic should be capable of. Not in their world. "Maybe she's praying," one of the younger engineers jeered, stepping closer. "Hey, lady, this is engineering, not church. Prayers won't fix a jet engine." Her hand hovered motionless over the intake port. She had spent 5 years hiding, 5 years buried under guilt, shame, and the quiet monotony of library work. She could walk away now, save face, return to her simple, anonymous life. Or she could tell the truth, stand against a corrupted version of her life's work, and accept whatever fallout came next. Even if it meant being seen again, even if it meant losing the fragile piece she'd built. 20 minutes gone, Richard said, savoring every second. But Eleanor had already begun. Her hands, one steady and one still cramped from old injury, moved with a grace that belied the damage. She traced every wire, every valve, each conduit against the original blueprint she still carried in her mind. This was her work, corrupted and sold like scrap, its beauty mangled by incompetence and greed. The crowd still heckled, their amusement reaching a fever pitch, but Eleanor no longer heard them. The noise had melted away. Her right hand protested every twist, every adjustment, but she pushed through. Each accurate maneuver was a silent rebellion against the pain Daniel had left her with. 10 minutes, Richard crowed, feigning concern. "Looks like Miss Mitchell is learning there's a difference between fixing a Toyota and building aerospace systems." Eleanor said nothing. She stepped back from the engine, placed her tools gently on the workbench. For a moment, the room held its breath. Was she giving up? Then she reached into her pocket and withdrew something small, something she hadn't shown anyone in 5 years, a worn NASA pin. Its engraving faded but still legible. Ad astra per aspera, to the stars through hardship. It caught the light, and with it, something inside her reignited. In that flash, she saw the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, 8 years old, eyes wide with wonder as the shuttle ascended in a blaze of fire. She heard her father's voice again, soft and resolute. "You were born to soar, Eleanor. Don't let them clip your wings." She saw the faces of her old team at NASA, scientists and engineers who had trusted her, collaborated with her, dreamed of Mars alongside her. They wouldn't want her to walk away. They wouldn't want their work reduced to a flawed mock-up sold by a traitor. They deserved justice. "Are you giving up?" Sarah Chen asked, eyes gleaming, certain of victory. "We don't have all day for your little performance." Eleanor didn't look at her. Instead, she turned her gaze to the cloudy Detroit sky beyond the window. Somewhere past that gray veil was the universe, the one she had once sworn to reach. She could pretend this wasn't her fight. But if this engine flew, if even one person died because of her silence, she would never forgive herself. Integrity wasn't about applause. It was about the hard choice, the right choice, made when no one was watching. 5 minutes, Richard declared smugly. Time to admit what everyone already knows. Eleanor turned to face the crowd, and something in her posture changed. Her shoulders squared, her jaw set. The front row engineers shifted uncomfortably, sensing a shift they couldn't explain. When she spoke, her voice cut through the noise like a scalpel. "I need a digital micromotor and a precision pressure calibration kit," she said clearly. "Matuo and Fluke models, specifically." Gasps rose from the crowd, not because of what she said, but how she said it. Her tone carried authority, precision, experience, the kind earned from thousands of hours in a lab, not from watching YouTube tutorials. She stepped closer to the engine. "Unless," she added without emotion, "you want this thing to explode at 40,000 feet." James Morrison stumbled over his words, baffled. "Wait, what? Did you say explode?" Eleanor didn't answer. Her focus had narrowed to a fine point. With swift, practiced movements that ignored the tremble in her injured hand, she removed the first panel of the pressure regulation system. No hesitation, no wasted motion. The silence in the hall deepened. The room was suspended in silence, the air heavy with the weight of revelation. Eleanor stood tall, framed by the low hum of the RS-7000's calibrated engine still purring behind her, a machine brought back from the brink of disaster by hands the industry had cast out. $1, she repeated, eyes locking with each disbelieving face in turn. Because what matters isn't status, pedigree, or titles you plaster after your name. What matters is truth, precision, responsibility, especially when lives are at stake. No one moved, not Sarah Chen, whose face had turned the color of ash, not James Morrison, whose MIT ring suddenly seemed more ornamental than earned, not Richard Sterling, now slumped in his chair, broken under the weight of his own arrogance. Even the youngest engineer in the room, the one who had mocked Eleanor's trembling hand, could only whisper, "She rebuilt the system in 30 minutes. What the hell have we been doing for 3 days?" Eleanor took a long breath. For 5 years she had folded herself into silence, letting whispers and doctored reports bury the truth. But truth, she now understood, was like fire. It could be smothered, hidden, denied, but eventually it found air, and when it did, it burned. She stepped down from the stage. Journalists pushed forward, microphones outstretched, questions tumbling over each other. "Doctor, Mitchell, where have you been?" Do you plan to return to aerospace? Will you testify against Lockheed? What does this mean for NASA? But Eleanor didn't answer. Not yet. She walked past them all, moving with the steady confidence of a woman no longer hiding. At the exit, the elderly journalist who had recognized her stopped her with a gentle touch. His eyes, wet with emotion, held a tremor of awe. They said you were gone, that you gave up. I did, Eleanor said quietly. But giving up and being gone aren't the same thing. He nodded, too choked to speak, and Eleanor gave him a small smile before stepping out into the pale afternoon light. Detroit's skyline stretched around her, harsh, gray, unremarkable, but somewhere beyond that sky were the stars she had once promised herself she'd touch. She might never get there now. She might never build engines for Mars or plant her name in the red soil of a new world. But she had reclaimed something just as valuable. Her name, her truth, her future. As she walked toward the edge of the Sterling Aerospace campus, past walls that had tried to bury her and a system that had discarded her, a young woman in a technician's uniform ran after her, breathless. "Doctor!" "Mitchell!" Eleanor turned. I just wanted to say thank you. You showed us what real engineering looks like, what integrity looks like. I didn't know people like you still existed." Eleanor smiled, her eyes softening. "They do," she said. "They're just harder to hear over all the noise." And with that, she walked on, into the future, one step at a time, no longer chasing redemption. She was redemption. To the stars, through difficulty. Ad astra per aspera. "You want to know who I really am?" Eleanor's voice was calm, but it carried like a stone skipping across still water. "I'm someone who believes talent doesn't live in diplomas hanging on walls or in the circumstances of birth. It lives in passion, in dedication, and in the courage to keep going when the world tells you you're not enough." The conference hall remained frozen in absolute silence as Eleanor Mitchell gathered her simple canvas bag. Around her stood 200 people, the same engineers who had mocked her, the executives who had schemed to humiliate her, the journalists who had come expecting to document her failure. Now they stood like statues carved from shame and revelation. Sarah Chen was the first to break. Her voice cracked through the hush, thick with unshed tears. "Wait. Please, I'm so sorry. What we did, it was unforgivable." Eleanor paused at the edge of the stage, looking back at the young woman who had been among her cruelest tormentors. "Sorry doesn't change what happened, Sarah," she said softly, "but it might change what happens next." James Morrison stepped forward, his once proud MIT ring feeling like a shackle around his finger. "Dr. Mitchell, please stay. Sterling Aerospace needs someone like you. We can offer any position, any salary." But Eleanor shook her head gently. "What you need isn't me. What you need is to change, not to hire me to absolve your guilt. Look around this room. How many women are on your engineering team? How many brilliant minds have you rejected because they didn't graduate from the right school or look the right way?" She gestured toward the engine, its perfectly calibrated hum filling the silence. "That machine doesn't care about your prejudices. Neither should you." Richard Sterling finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I'll make this right. I'll restore your reputation. I'll ensure the world knows the truth." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "Then don't do it for me. Do it for the next Eleanor, the one sitting in a garage right now, dreaming of building something extraordinary, but being told she's not enough." A young reporter, barely out of college, raised a hand timidly. "Dr. Mitchell, where will you go now? Surely NASA would—" "I'm going back to the library," Eleanor said simply, "where I help children from poor neighborhoods learn about science, where an 8-year-old girl can dream about Mars without being told she's the wrong gender or the wrong class." And with that, she walked toward the exit. The crowd parted like a biblical sea, creating a path for the woman they had once tried to erase. At the door, she turned one last time, her silhouette framed by the Detroit afternoon pouring through glass. Someone once called me decorative window dressing. Pretty, but useless. But every flower has thorns, and sometimes those thorns are necessary to protect the beauty within. She left, disappearing into the sunlight and the street noise and the indifferent rhythm of a city that barely knew it had just witnessed something extraordinary. Inside, Sarah Chen sank into a chair, tears flowing freely now as she stared at her own hands, the same ones that had pointed and laughed at a legend she hadn't recognized. James Morrison took the MIT diploma off his wall. He looked at it as if seeing, for the first time, how little it truly meant without humanity behind it. Richard Sterling stood alone beside a $2 million engine, repaired by a woman he'd dismissed as unworthy. His empire of arrogance, built on stolen genius, crumbled around him. The elderly journalist who had first recognized Eleanor wrote the final line in his notebook with a trembling hand. "Today, I witnessed the loudest silence I've ever heard, the moment when dignity defeated arrogance without raising its voice." Outside, Eleanor Mitchell vanished into the Detroit crowd, just as she had vanished from Houston 5 years before. But this time, she wasn't running from anything. She had found herself again, not in accolades or applause, but in the simple, stubborn act of doing what was right, even when it cost everything. Monday would find her back at the library helping young minds discover the wonders of science, planting seeds in soil society might otherwise overlook, and maybe among those kids would be the next revolutionary, the next dreamer, the next Eleanor. Because some battles are won not with power, but with dignity intact. Eleanor had chosen not to destroy the people who tried to humiliate her. She didn't wield her brilliance like a weapon. She wielded it like a scalpel, clean, precise, healing. In a world that often mistakes cruelty for strength and credentials for capability, she showed us something far more powerful. That true power lies in knowing exactly who you are, no matter what others think you should be. And now, ask yourself, if you were in her place, surrounded by those who tried to break you, would you have forgiven?